So why a small town in Alabama in 1950? Why was that the setting?
Well, 1950 especially because of the genesis of the electric guitar. I wanted to find that point where it had been invented, and if you were a young guy like Gary Clark Jr. plays in the movie, you would have read about it in Popular Electronics, and there would have been an article by Les Paul about this new thing that he's kind of come up with, but it was not commercially available on a wide scale until later in that year, and the electric bass didn't come around until 51. So it was really a very, very new phenomenon, and I really feel like that technology was what started what we now call rock and roll being possible. Until then, truly, as they say in the movie, the guitar was kind of sideman. Unless you were an old blues guy and you were doing slide guitar and that was the only instrument, most of the people playing were off on the side. You might get a nice little polite solo, and then the piano could put out volume, and the sax could blow that off the stage. And until you had that electric guitar and the amplifier that went with it, you couldn't, walk into town and take over a stage the way that you could later. The little town in Alabama, because I wanted it to hook into, there's kind of a rock and roll legend about a guy named Guitar Slim, who was a New Orleans player, one of the early electric guitar players, who had a big hit with a song called The Things I Used to Do, that was actually arranged by Ray Charles when he was 19 years old. And, but he, it was a jukebox hit, but he was known to miss a gig because he partied pretty hard. And so a lot of the guys who became the icons of rhythm and blues, Albert Collins, Albert King, B.B. King, they all have the story that at some point somebody turned to them and said, "Can you play the song? Well, tonight you are Guitar Slim," because nobody knew what he looked like. There weren't album covers, there wasn't MTV, and they said, "Sure, I can play that." But it would have to be somewhere that wasn't a big town that he would have played before.
Yeah, all right. And that's all very, very true. As a matter of fact, a lot of stories about that kind of thing that fell in for him. And of course, the pictures. Well, when we're talking about the characters, let's think about the characters. You mentioned Guitar Slim as being the sort of spark or kernel for Guitar Sam. Were there other performers, and let's think about some of the other characters, musical characters in the film, were you thinking of real performers or maybe types or? Yeah,
well, one of the things that I do for the actors before any movie is I write a bio for every character. And so if you do the math, Danny Glover's over 50. This is set in 1950. You figure out how old that character of Tyrone Perkins would be. This is a guy who grew up with the music. And one of the reasons that, we had to be very specific with our players was because music only, it travels around, but it only gets to a certain point. There's a little bit of New Orleans style in his piano playing style. So part of his bio was that he spent a little time in New Orleans. The character that Eddie Shaw plays, Tom Trenier, is supposed to be a guy, and if you figure out the ages, he could have played with Buddy Bolden, and King Oliver in New Orleans, and some of those guys lasted into the rock and roll era. They were there for the very beginning of jazz and blues, and they lasted into the rock and roll era. There's a guy named Earl Palmer, who's a famous rock and roll drummer who was on half of the early rock and roll hits, and he's probably the guy who first started playing a backbeat, because Little Richard sang so damn fast that just to keep place you had to put a backbeat on it. And he started out as a tap dancer as a little boy in New Orleans. So yeah, a lot of the stories that I'd heard, autobiographies of blues players and jazz players and rock and roll players. That instrument you see at the beginning is called a diddley bow, from whence we get bow diddley. And it was made from the wire that used to keep the broom straw on a broom, and you'd unwrap it and stretch it tight and wrap it around some nails, and you could bottleneck on that if you couldn't afford a guitar. So a lot of the stories of individual musicians get into the stories that Danny tells or that you see in the movie.
One of the things, at least in my opinion, with musical movies that are not documentaries, is there's been this real struggle over time to figure out how to balance acting and musical performance. It seems like some of them do one part well and not the other, and you all did some work on making that happen. So how did you approach that issue? How did you deal with that challenge?
Well, mainly in the casting, and then in the way that we recorded it. So the first thing that we knew is we needed some young guy who could play that kind of guitar. And there's not that many young African Americans playing that kind of guitar. Our friend Lewis Black, who runs the South by Southwest Music Festival, heard what the movie was about and said, "Oh, you got to come see this kid, Gary Clark Jr." And we met Gary the night he turned 21. He was playing at the festival, and he just blew us away. Just a great player. And then we took him over to our friend's house the next morning, and he read for the part. And he was pretty good. He had acted maybe when he was in junior high school or something like that, but had never been in a movie. Kev Lowe had done some plays, so he was at least a little more comfortable with it. Eddie Shaw had never acted before, plays Chaim Trenier, but it turns out, I didn't know this until after we cast him, that his son is Stan Shaw, who's a very well-known actor in Hollywood. And then, basically you just kind of, Mabel John, who was originally going to be Ruth Brown, and she actually pre-recorded some stuff with us, and then she fell ill during the shooting of it. And then Mabel, who was she ran the Raylettes for Ray Charles for years and was a Stax artist, and really tremendous person as well as a tremendous artist. She jumped in very heroically with 10 days before she had to shoot. And she's at least a performer, and her acting was good enough for this part, and she could do more if she wanted to, just like Ruth Brown, who ended up doing some good acting stuff. And then as we recorded it, it was important to me that the solos, the kind of emotional part of the music, were really solos. They were really live. So we pre-recorded Danny's stuff, and Danny took some piano lessons, so his hands are in the right places, but he wasn't playing. We took the cuts out of the piano so he didn't make any noise. In one of the outtakes, when he's rocking during the last song, you see he's playing along, and the drink on the table is going toward the edge, and at one point he goes, puts it back, puts it again. But other than that, stuff was live. So the piano laid down the rhythm, and we had pre-recorded some of the drum stuff. Although Stefan, who's the kid who plays, is a real player as well. So he was playing along most of the time. And then the other guys got to play live each take. And so their solos were different each time, the way they came together, and it's a little raw because they didn't play together much. They had maybe an hour of rehearsal, truly an hour before the day before we did this, because I didn't want them to be too smooth. But they're good players, And after the first 2 takes, I mean, it's great to see a crew applaud, because they're doing their jobs and everything, but then they just got into the music. And we did very careful kind of separating of the instruments, so when you cut to the sax, I could bring the sax up and none of the other instruments come up. So a lot of that was pre-planned. So I've done this before. Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio in Limbo, she really sings on camera, and only the drums was pre-recorded so that everything would be on the same beat, because she's got to act while she's singing. And it's terrible to ask any actor to lip sync to themselves, even if they're just playing an instrument.